So with Resident Evil 3's remake out, and I've beaten it twice by the way, I wanted to take a look back at my journey with this franchise and what I hope to see going forward, so allow me to start from the beginning. When I was a wee lad, my friend was a big fan of Resident Evil. Now, I wasn't a fearless child. Scary movies, scary images, and of course scary games were all things that I just didn't want any part of. Still, when I went over to my friend's house and saw him play Resident Evil 2, I figured, well, if he likes this, then maybe I should too. So, against my better judgment, I went to Blockbuster. Yes, Blockbuster, in the hopes to rent Resident Evil 2, but unfortunately I couldn't find it. However, I did find Resident Evil 3, so I figured, well, this is just the next best thing. So I booted it up and got a little unnerved by the opening cutscene, but pressed forward. And I thought to myself, you are a brave boy. You can do the things that your friends can do. That is until I crossed paths with him. Nemesis. The second he showed up, I noped hardcore out of that game and never touched it again. Nemesis was the source of many nightmares for me after that. In fact, because of him, I swore off of all Resident Evil games going forward, thinking that I wanted nothing to do with the terrifying franchise. So I didn't play a single Resident Evil game for a long time. I just skipped the whole damn franchise. Of course, as I got older, I grew a bit of a backbone, and while browsing GameStop one day, a discounted copy of Resident Evil 5 caught my eye. So I just bought it and played through a game that at the time was the most up-to-date in the franchise. I had no idea who any of the characters were, nor did I know anything about the expansive lore of Resident Evil. I just jumped into the body of a steroided-out military dude named Chris Redfield and started shooting enemies that were neither particularly scary nor were they zombies, which was the main source of my initial disappointment with this game. I mean, I thought Resident Evil games were zombie games, so why the hell am I suddenly fighting these dudes that have weird tentacle things growing out of their heads and stuff? But I kept pressing forward and gunning down the enemies with my dumbass partner that would rather unload precious ammo into my chest. Still, I accepted the game and its challenges for what it was, and while it didn't blow my socks off, it did expose me to a whole new world in gaming that I wanted more of. Despite my official debut into the Resident Evil world, I didn't go back to any of the previous games. Instead, I decided to educate myself. Playing through Resident Evil 5, I knew that many of the characters I was encountering were characters that I should have known by this point. I should know who Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and Albert Wesker are. So instead of playing all of the previous games, I decided to do the next best thing and watch the cutscenes of every Resident Evil game that came before. After that, I had a decent idea of who these characters were and what they had been through. Then came along Resident Evil 6, a game that brought back zombies, or at least a version of them, and tried to create a game that pleased all fans of the franchise. Which brings me to my next point. It was around this time that I began to see a rift in the Resident Evil fandom. Of course, Resident Evils of the past focused on survival horror, a genre that creates tension from having limited and scarce resources, and a genre that early Resident Evil games defined. But as the franchise grew older and games like Call of Duty started dominating the market, the Resident Evil developers Capcom decided to move along with the tide. With Resident Evil 5, the survival horror aspect was replaced with just a straight-up action game. You played a buffed-out main character who had all the weapons and ammo in the world to just fire away at enemies. The thing is, Resident Evil 5 really deviated from what fans were familiar with. It tried to evolve to fit an evolving market. A move that makes sense, but certainly not one that fans enjoyed. So in addition to the game's terrible AI, the game was critically hammered, seeing as it strayed too far from the path. I enjoyed it well enough, but considering that I was hoping for a game akin to the games that terrified me as a kid, I could understand the frustrations of some of the fans. Going back to Resident Evil 6, this was a game that the developers decided to go, okay, so we're going to do a bit of everything here. Survival horror, action, mixture of both. And I'm not going to lie, I enjoyed the game. Perhaps it's because I wasn't an old school fan and had to play the original, so I didn't have that sense of nostalgia. But from my perspective, I played Resident Evil 5, and then 6 was an improvement. The thing that I really liked is that it brought back zombies, but I also noticed its attention to detail with the writing of its story. The game has 3 main campaigns and then a 4th unlockable one, so unless you play all 4, you never get a full sense of the full story. Granted, most people note its story might have been a little overcomplicated, and the fact that it tried to mix different genres together resulted in a game that was a bit of a mess, and I don't disagree with that. It didn't know what kind of game it wanted to be, and because of that, fans don't think back fondly on it. Regardless, I still enjoyed it. So at this point, I was in on the Resident Evil franchise. It didn't matter what it did going forward, I was all in no matter what. Now at this point, I started exploring more of the horror franchise like Outlast, Alien Isolation, Evil Within, and then came a game that I was very excited for. Resident Evil 7. Now this is an interesting entry in the series because this was not only meant to reinvent the franchise by having you play from a first-person perspective for the first time in the series, but it was also a return to form with its classic focus on survival horror. And it pulled it off perfectly. The game was fantastic and was praised by critics. So it seemed that Resident Evil had found its way back home, but it needed to take just a bit more of a step. Enter the Resident Evil 2 Remake, which is my favorite of the franchise. Yup, you heard me right. The Resident Evil 2 Remake, even after playing the Resident Evil 3 3 Remake is still on top for me as the best Resident Evil game that I have ever played. Now, before I go into why that's the case, I do want to take a brief moment to talk about Resident Evil 2 because this was a big deal for me. A year ago, I made a video about future video game remakes following the remake of Resident Evil 2. The thing is that this particular remake truly remade the game. A side-by-side comparison of the original 1998 Resident Evil 2 with the 2019 remake, you'd never know that they were the same game. It completely reinvented and, in my opinion, perfected the Resident Evil formula. Resident Evil 2 is perfection, and I can't praise it enough. But what's particularly important about this is that about 20 years after seeing my friend play the original Resident Evil 2 and then failing to find it in Blockbuster, I was finally able to play it myself. And I not only played this game, I mastered it. I played the game countless times in an effort to obtain all the trophies on the PS4, which I did. I know where everything is in that game, the answer to every puzzle. Never in my gaming life have I ever set out to learn a game to such a degree before. So when it was announced that Resident Evil 3 would be getting the same treatment, I was over the moon excited. In my head, this was a game that scared me as a child, and I was finally going back to face Nemesis, the source of my nightmares from 20 years ago. But I was mainly excited because I wanted to play more of a game like Resident Evil 2, and this was a remake that was promising that. But before the Resident Evil 3 remake release, I decided to go back in time. I purchased 2 new Resident Evil games. One was the original remake as well as Resident Evil 0, both releasing in the early 2000s. So I played through the very first Resident Evil and got a taste of things that the old school fans had experienced, and I loved it. It took a second for me to get used to the fixed camera angles and the shooting mechanics, but once I got it, it was on. The backtracking, the puzzles, the forcing me to sit and use my head was all things that I wanted from the experience, and it was all what I had experienced while playing the remake of Resident Evil 2. Once I beat the first Resident Evil, I just wanted more, so I figured Resident Evil 0 is pretty much the same game, so I just dove right in. The thing about Resident Evil 0 is that while it plays the same as the original's remake and it has a unique mechanic of controlling 2 characters at the same time, it was the inventory system that broke it for me. Removing inventory boxes was a critical failure, and just throwing things on the ground is a clunky replacement for it. After beating the first level of the game and realizing that I had dropped a shotgun, which was now locked behind me once I had advanced too far, I was just done with the game and had stopped before I got too far in. What was interesting is that after playing the first, second, and even 7th Resident Evil games, I started to see why fans might not have liked Resident Evil 6. Aside from a very involved narrative that could be perceived as convoluted, the game is a pretty poor Resident Evil game in general. What makes a Resident Evil game is its emphasis on survival horror, yet Resident Evils 5 and 6 tend to be more of a shooter. Not often do you stop to think about your ammo. You'll get swarmed by enemies and just start unloading what you have into them. Early on, especially with Leon's campaign, you'll be trying to pass zombies rather than fight them, but then eventually you get funneled into the type of strategy that the game wants you to utilize, and as you take out more enemies, it starts giving you more ammo for you to stockpile until it demands for you to just unload into a bunch of enemies. When you once needed to save what ammo you have and desperately search for more is completely gone, as enemies will just straight up drop ammo for you. Very often you'll have more ammo than you know what to do with until the game presents a bunch of enemies for you to unload into. It's just not the Resident Evil way. There is no survival for the survival horror. Another major difference with RE6 is its inventory system, or really a lack thereof. Gone is the need to manage what you're carrying because the game just lets you carry it all. At the start of the game, you'll play a sequence much further down the storyline and it will prompt you to change weapons. When you do this, you get a glimpse of all the weapons that Leon can accumulate throughout his campaign. So he'll just whip out an assault rifle and start gunning zombies down. The game is also extremely linear. It isn't until maybe Ada's campaign do you start to see puzzles much closer to that of a typical Resident Evil. But even Leon's campaign is all about fighting through zombies just to reach the next area. There is no backtracking, no need to find a set of keys to unlock certain doors, no special items to carry around to interact with specific things. You just move forward. So all in all, Resident Evil 6, while still a game I enjoy, is simply not a good Resident Evil game, and now I know why. Now I think if you go into Resident Evil 6 expecting an action-adventure shooter while also based in the Resident Evil universe, you'll find a lot of enjoyment there. It's not a bad game, it's just a bad Resident Evil game. But what about the Resident Evil 3 remake? Now when that game released, I was so ready for it. I beat that game in one day with an hour break in the middle. I was ready and wanted to be consumed by the game, and I was. And I got most of what I wanted. I feared Nemesis way more than Mr. X. I was so excited to get to fight against him and explore the chaos-filled streets of Raccoon City. And while Resident Evil 3 was a great game and something that I would recommend, I still found myself somewhat disappointed when I compare it to Resident Evil 2. Now, I realize that this is a me problem because like I said, Resident Evil 3's Remake is still a great game, but I wouldn't call it a masterpiece like I would with Resident Evil 2. My first major gripe with it is Nemesis himself. Yes, I feared him way more than Mr. X, but in a different way. While active in Resident Evil 2, Mr. X was a wild card. While he was easy to avoid when you knew where he was, you still needed to know where he was. X could be anywhere, and not knowing where he is resulted in some of the most tense moments in Resident Evil 2. Nemesis doesn't work the same way. Most of the encounters with him are either cutscenes, scripted sequences, or straight up boss battles. He doesn't take away from the monster that is Nemesis, but what does disappoint is that the one point where he does appear and stalk you, unlike X, he knows where you are at all times. So you run. Now this isn't a bad thing because it is easily the most tense moment in the entire game as you run against an enemy that is stronger, faster, and tougher than you in every way. Nemesis's speed is nightmare fuel as he pursues you, but it is only during that one sequence. I wanted Nemesis to be a constant threat in the game. I didn't want him to always know where I was. I wanted to be able to avoid him, but I also wanted to be checking around every corner to see if he was just standing there waiting for me. Now, the other thing that disappointed me was that Resident Evil 3 doesn't have much of, if any, backtracking. Resident Evil 2 will have you returning to the police station up until the final level as you acquire new items that can unlock new areas in the station. But in Resident Evil 3, as you progress, the need to backtrack becomes less and less. Aside from the streets of Raccoon City, the game becomes way more linear. Those are the two big things for me, Nemesis and the lack of backtracking. Now, it doesn't make Resident Evil 3 a bad game, just not as good as Resident Evil 2. So the question becomes, what does the future of Resident Evil hold? We know we will get a sequel to Resident Evil 7 featuring the same main character and likely a return to the first-person gameplay. I am willing to bet that we have not seen the last of the remakes of the earlier titles. Many people are speculating that Capcom will look to Resident Evil 4 to remake next, but considering how beloved that game is, I'm thinking that they won't touch it. Resident Evil 5 and 6 are still pretty newish, so touching them doesn't really sound like a good idea. Now, they could go for Resident Evil 1 or 0, or even something like Code Veronica, but who knows, maybe all they wanted to do was remake 2 and 3. Now, I would be 110% on board for a new spin-off with the same mechanics that we saw with the recent remakes. My personal opinion would be to feature a game surrounding Ada Wong and give her own game taking place maybe after Resident Evil 6. But honestly, the thing that I'm most hoping for is a game that takes the Mr. X mechanic and builds an entire game around it. You play a character that is constantly stalked by a tyrant-like creature. I know that story beat is just like Nemesis, but I mean from a gameplay standpoint, as you try to backtrack and solve puzzles, there is always that stalking enemy. And the reason why I say Mr. X-like and not Nemesis-like is because I want an enemy that will always be searching for you while not always knowing where you are. When active, Nemesis always knew where you were, and I wanted more of that Outlast or Alien Isolation feel. Knowing that the enemy is around, just not always on you, but the threat is still there, that's the game I want. Just a whole game like that. Now, if I were a betting man, I would say that the next thing we see from Resident Evil would be Resident Evil 8 being the follow-up to 7 and continuing that story. But maybe we will see a bit of what I've already mentioned being implemented into that game. Hopefully, Capcom looks to the remakes and identifies the best parts of it to apply it to future projects. No matter what happens, the future is very bright for this franchise. I simply cannot wait for whatever that future is. Now, before you ask, no, I've never played Resident Evil 4, but I do fully intend to eventually. Just need a bit of a Resident Evil break right now. So what is your favorite Resident Evil game? Let me know down in the comments below. Before I end this video, I would kindly ask for you to give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and if you want to see more, check out some of the other videos, and please consider subscribing and clicking the notification bell so you can be up to date on all future uploads. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.